He thought he could humiliate her in front of the most powerful people in the room. But he had no idea he had just walked into the moment that would destroy everything he'd built. The restaurant shimmered under soft golden chandeliers, each crystal reflecting quiet conversations and calculated smiles, the kind of place where a single handshake could move billions of dollars and a single mistake could cost everything. At the center table, Richard Halston sat like he owned the air itself, his tailored navy suit perfect down to the last stitch, his watch catching light with every subtle movement of his wrist, a silent reminder that time, like power, belonged to him. Across from him, 3 international partners listened closely, their voices low, their expressions sharp, each word measured as they edged closer to finalizing a $3 billion deal that had taken 18 months of negotiation, dozens of flights, and countless closed-door meetings to reach this exact moment. Every detail had been controlled, every variable calculated, every risk minimized, because in rooms like this, control wasn't optional, it was everything. And yet, just a few steps away, unnoticed by most, Olivia Carter moved quietly between tables, her black uniform simple, her posture calm, her presence almost invisible in a room designed to highlight power and diminish everything else. She carried a tray with steady hands, her movements precise but unassuming, the kind of efficiency that comes from years of experience and a discipline that didn't need recognition to exist. To most people in that room, she was just another waitress, another background detail in a carefully curated environment of wealth and influence. But Olivia's eyes moved differently. They didn't linger on tips or tables. They observed. They tracked. They measured. Every shift in tone, every glance exchanged, every subtle signal that passed between the men at the center table didn't go unnoticed by her. And as she approached Richard's table, drawn by a small imbalance, a wine glass placed slightly off-center, a minor imperfection in an otherwise flawless setting, she reached forward with quiet intention, her fingers moving. To correct it. It should have been nothing. A small adjustment. A detail restored. But in that exact moment, something shifted. Richard's eyes snapped toward her hand, his expression tightening, his control threatened not by the action itself, but by what it represented, a disruption, however small, in a world he believed he commanded completely. And then, without hesitation, without restraint, his voice cut through the room. Don't touch that. It wasn't just loud. It was sharp, final, designed to be heard. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused inches from lips. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the echo of his words settled into the silence like a verdict already passed. Olivia froze for just a fraction of a second, her hand still hovering near the glass, before slowly pulling it back. She didn't apologize. She didn't react. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, unshaken. And in that quiet, in that stillness that followed his outburst, something unseen began to move, something far more powerful than the man who believed he had just asserted control, something that would, in less than 10 seconds, make every person in that room realize that power doesn't always announce itself. And sometimes, it waits for the exact moment you underestimate it the most. The silence did not break right away. It stretched, heavy and deliberate, as if the entire room instinctively understood that something had just shifted beneath the surface, something invisible but undeniable, and Richard felt it even before he could explain it, a subtle crack in the control he had spent years perfecting. Because in rooms like this, power was not just about money, it was about perception. And perception had just slipped from his grasp for a fraction of a second, long enough for doubt to enter. And doubt was dangerous. Across the table, Marcus Lee, one of the key investors, slowly set his glass down with a precision that did not match his earlier relaxed posture, his eyes moving not toward Richard, but toward Olivia, studying her in a way that no one else had thought to, as if reevaluating a detail everyone else had dismissed, while Elena Kovac, the European legal advisor, adjusted her posture slightly, her expression tightening just enough to signal that her attention had shifted from the contract in front of her to the dynamic unfolding in the room. Richard noticed it. Of course he did, and it irritated him more than the interruption itself, because this was his environment, his negotiation, his moment, and no waitress, no matter how careless, had the right to redirect the focus. So he forced a small smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes, and cleared his throat as if resetting the atmosphere. As I was saying, he began, his voice measured again, attempting to pull the room back under his control, but the words did not land the same way. They felt thinner, less grounded, as if the foundation beneath them had shifted without permission. Olivia, meanwhile, had already stepped back, her tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, her posture unchanged, her face calm in a way that did not match the tension she had just been placed in, and for a brief moment, she reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against the small earpiece hidden beneath her hair, a gesture so subtle it could have been mistaken for adjusting a strand of hair, but it was not unnoticed by Marcus, whose gaze sharpened instantly, nor by Elena, whose eyes flickered with recognition of something she could not yet name. Then it began, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Richard's phone vibrated against the table. Once, a short, controlled buzz that he ignored, because in high-level negotiations, interruptions were common and rarely important. But then it buzzed again, longer this time, followed by a third vibration that lingered just enough to demand attention, and across from him, Marcus's phone lit up at the exact same moment, followed by Elena's, and then another executive at the end of the table glanced down at his screen, his expression shifting from neutral to concerned in less than a second. Richard frowned, his hand hovering near his phone, but not yet reaching for it, because reacting too quickly would signal uncertainty, and uncertainty was something he never allowed himself to display. But the room was changing, the air tightening as each notification arrived, like a quiet signal that something larger was unfolding beyond the walls of the restaurant. Marcus finally picked up his phone, his eyes scanning the screen, and whatever he saw caused a subtle but undeniable shift in his demeanor, his shoulders straightening, his jaw tightening slightly, as if recalculating something critical, and when he looked back up, he did not look at Richard with the same confidence as before. Instead, there was caution, the kind that only appeared when new information disrupted a carefully constructed decision. Elena followed, reading her own notification, her lips pressing together in a thin line, her fingers tapping once against the table before she slowly closed the document in front of her. And that single action, small as it was, sent a ripple through the group. Because in negotiations like this, closing the document meant one thing: the deal was no longer moving forward as planned. Richard felt it now, unmistakably. The control he had walked into the room with was no longer his alone. Something else had entered the equation, something he did not see coming. And for the first time that evening, his confidence did not feel like certainty. It felt like something he was trying to hold together. And across the room, Olivia had already turned away, walking calmly toward another table as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just set something into motion that no one at that table fully understood yet. But they were about to, because the next notification would not be one they could ignore. The next vibration was louder, or at least it felt that way, because by now every person at the table was aware that something was unfolding in real time, something none of them had planned for, and Richard could no longer ignore it, his hand finally reaching for his phone with a controlled motion that was meant to signal calm. But the moment his eyes scanned the screen, that calm fractured, not visibly at first, but internally, sharply, because the message was not just unexpected, it was impossible to ignore: pending approval revoked, followed by a string of legal references and a notification from his own compliance division. And before he could process it fully, another message appeared, then another, each one stacking onto the last like a chain reaction that had already been set in motion before he even realized there was a trigger. Across from him, Marcus leaned back slightly, his fingers steepled together, his gaze no longer collaborative but analytical, as if he were reassessing the entire situation from a distance. "Richard," he said slowly, his tone careful but firm, "we are receiving alerts from our risk team." And that single sentence landed heavier than any accusation, because it meant the issue was no longer internal. It had expanded beyond Richard's control, beyond this room, into systems and networks that operated independently of his influence. Elena glanced down at her phone again, her expression tightening further. "There is a flag on your corporate structure," she added, her voice precise, every word measured. "Something has triggered an immediate review." And the word immediate hung in the air like a Deadline no one could negotiate with. Richard's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities, trying to identify the source, the cause, the one variable he had overlooked, but nothing made sense. Everything had been vetted, cleared, secured. This deal had passed through layers of scrutiny that made failure nearly impossible. And yet here it was, unraveling in front of him, not with chaos, but with cold, systematic precision. Another executive at the table spoke up, his voice lower now, less confident than before. Our board just sent a directive to pause all engagements connected to this transaction. And that was the moment the room shifted completely, because a pause at that level was not temporary. It was a signal, a warning that something deeper was wrong, something that could not be ignored or explained away with a quick reassurance. Richard placed his phone down slowly, his fingers lingering on the surface as if grounding himself. But his control was slipping, not dramatically, not outwardly, but in the subtle ways that mattered most in rooms like this. The way his voice did not come immediately when he tried to respond. The way his eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second longer than they should have. The way the confidence that had defined him only minutes ago now felt like something he was trying to reconstruct rather than project. And then Marcus spoke again, this time more directly. We need clarity before we proceed. And it was not a suggestion, it was a boundary, one that had not existed before Olivia stepped to that table. Richard followed Marcus's gaze without realizing it, his eyes tracking across the room until they found her again, moving calmly between tables, speaking softly to another guest, her demeanor unchanged, as if she were completely disconnected from the collapse unfolding just a few feet away. And yet something about her presence now felt different, not larger, not louder, but heavier, as if the room itself was subtly orienting around her in a way that no one had consciously decided. He replayed the moment in his mind, the glass, the interruption, her stillness, the way she had touched her earpiece, and for the first time, a thought entered his mind that he could not immediately dismiss. What if that moment had not been insignificant? What if it had been the beginning? And as another notification lit up his screen, this one marked urgent, Richard understood something he had never had to consider before. This was not random. This was not coincidence. This was intentional. And whatever had just been set in motion, it had been waiting for him to make that exact mistake. The word intentional settled into Richard's mind like a weight he could not shake. Because if this was deliberate, then it meant someone had seen through him, anticipated him, and acted with a level of precision he had always believed only he possessed. And that realization did not come with panic. It came with something far more unsettling, a quiet loss of certainty. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through the cascade of messages now flooding in, each one confirming the same reality. From a different angle, compliance audits triggered, investor confidence alerts activated, regulatory flags raised at multiple levels, and the pattern was too coordinated, too immediate to be coincidence. It was as if an entire network had responded to a single signal, a single moment, and that moment replayed again in his mind with increasing clarity, her hand reaching toward the glass, his voice cutting through the room, her stillness, her gaze, and then that subtle movement at her ear. Across the table, Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone no longer collaborative but cautious. Richard, this is escalating faster than expected. And the phrase faster than expected carried an implication that Marcus was no longer just reacting, he was distancing himself, calculating risk in real time. While Elena closed her folder completely now, her posture shifting from engaged to reserved. Until this is resolved, we cannot proceed, she said calmly. But there was finality in her voice, the kind that did not invite negotiation, only acceptance. Richard exhaled slowly, forcing composure back into his expression, because losing control in front of them would only confirm what the alerts were already suggesting. But control, real control, was no longer in the room. It was somewhere else, somewhere unseen, and for the first time in years, he was not the one directing it. His eyes moved again, almost involuntarily, scanning the room until they found Olivia once more, now standing near the far end, speaking softly with another staff member, her posture relaxed, her movements measured. Nothing about her suggested urgency or concern, and yet everything about the situation pointed back to her, not through evidence, but through timing, through presence, through the undeniable shift that had occurred the moment she entered his space. Another notification appeared, this one from his legal team, marked critical, and when he opened it, the message was brief but devastating in its implication. Primary partner has initiated withdrawal protocol pending reputational review. And that was it. No explanation, no room for interpretation. Just a clear indication that the foundation of the deal had already begun to collapse from within. Marcus's phone buzzed again, and this time he did not hide his reaction. He looked directly at Richard, his expression no longer neutral. "We have been advised to step back immediately," he said, his voice steady but distant, as if the partnership they had built was already becoming something from the past rather than the present. The room felt different now, not tense, but hollow, as if the energy that had filled it earlier had been quietly removed, leaving behind only the structure, the table, the glasses, the people, all still in place but no longer connected by the purpose that had brought them together. Richard straightened slightly, attempting to reassert something, anything. "This is temporary," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they lacked the conviction that had once defined him, because deep down, he knew this was not a delay. It was a dismantling, precise and irreversible. And then, from across the room, Olivia turned, not toward him directly, but in his direction, her eyes meeting his for just a brief moment. And in that glance there was no anger, no satisfaction, no visible reaction at all, just a calm awareness, as if she had already seen this outcome long before he had even recognized the possibility. And in that instant, Richard understood something he could no longer deny. Whatever power he thought he had in this room, it had never been the only power present. It had simply been the loudest, and now, for the first time, something quieter had just proven it was stronger. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, like a quiet truth that could no longer be ignored, and Richard felt it in the way no one at the table was looking at him the same way anymore, not with admiration, not with confidence, but with calculation, the kind reserved for liabilities, not partners. Marcus leaned back fully now, creating a physical distance that mirrored the professional one already forming, his voice calm but detached. "We will need to formally withdraw until further notice." And there was no hesitation in his tone, no room left for persuasion, while Elena gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, confirming the decision without adding another word, because at this level, silence carried more weight than argument. Richard's fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, grounding himself as he scanned their faces. One last time, searching for any sign that this could be reversed, that this was a misunderstanding, a temporary disruption, but all he found was resolve, and something else beneath it, something sharper, awareness, as if they had already concluded what he was only beginning to understand. His phone buzzed again, and this time he did not hesitate, opening the message immediately, his eyes locking onto the single line that removed any remaining doubt. Transaction terminated effective. Immediately. And just like that, 18 months of strategy, negotiation, and control dissolved into a sentence that offered no explanation and no appeal. The room did not react with shock, not outwardly, but the shift was undeniable. Chairs moved slightly, documents were closed, glasses set down with finality, and the energy that had once been focused on building something now redirected itself toward exiting, disengaging, moving on. Richard inhaled slowly, attempting to speak, to reclaim even a fraction of the authority he had walked in with. But the words did not come the way they used to. They felt heavier, slower, as if they no longer carried the same weight. "There must be an error," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was not an error. It was a decision, one that had already been made without him. Across the room, Olivia placed a tray down on a nearby service station, her movements as steady as they had been from the beginning, unaffected, unhurried, as if the collapse unfolding behind her existed in a different world entirely. And yet every part of that collapse pointed back to the moment she had been dismissed, the moment he had chosen to assert power without understanding its limits. Richard pushed his chair back slightly, the subtle sound cutting through the quiet, drawing a few glances from nearby tables, but none from the ones that mattered, because those who mattered had already moved on, their attention no longer tied to him or his deal, but To whatever came next, Marcus stood first, adjusting his jacket with a practiced motion. "We will be in touch if circumstances change," he said, though both of them understood that circumstances had already changed in a way that would not reverse, and Elena followed, gathering her documents without urgency, her composure intact, her decision final. Richard remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze drifting once more across the room until it found Olivia again, and this time, he did not look away quickly, because now he was not just seeing a waitress, he was seeing the center of something he did not understand, something that had operated quietly, precisely, and without warning. And as she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his one last time, there was still no expression of victory, no acknowledgement of what had happened, only that same calm presence, steady and unchanged. And in that silence, in that absence of reaction, Richard understood the most unsettling truth of all. The power that had just undone him had never needed to raise its voice. It had only needed him to reveal his own. For a long moment, Richard did not move, not because he chose to stay seated, but because something inside him had not yet caught up with what had just happened, as if his mind was still trying to negotiate with a reality that had already closed its doors. And around him, the restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm. Conversations resumed in low tones, glasses clinked again, and the quiet elegance of the room reassembled itself as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. But at his table, the absence was unmistakable. The empty chairs where opportunity once sat now stood as silent proof that control, once lost, does not ask permission to leave. He finally rose, adjusting his jacket with a motion that felt more like habit than confidence, his posture still composed but no longer commanding. And as he stepped away from the table, he could feel it, not attention, not admiration, but awareness. Subtle glances from across the room, not focused on him, but on the shift that had taken place. The kind of shift that experienced people recognize without needing explanation. His phone remained in his hand, the screen still lit with messages that no longer required immediate reading because their meaning had already been delivered, not through words, but through outcome. He took a step forward, then another, his direction not entirely decided, until his path aligned once again with the one person who had not changed since the beginning of the evening. Olivia stood near the service station, noting something on a small tablet, her posture straight, her expression neutral, the same quiet presence that had existed before the room turned, during the moment it fractured, and now, after everything had settled into a new reality. Richard slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation, but out of something unfamiliar, something that did not quite fit into the frameworks he had always relied on, because for the first time, he was not approaching from a position of control, but from a position of uncertainty, and that changed everything. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, but far enough that the distance between them felt intentional, and for a brief moment, neither of them said anything. The silence not uncomfortable, but clear, like a space, where truth did not need to be forced. "What did you do?" he asked finally, his voice lower now, not sharp, not commanding, but searching. And the question itself carried more weight than any demand he had made earlier, because this time, it was not about asserting power, it was about understanding it. Olivia looked up from the tablet slowly, meeting his gaze with the same steady calm that had never once broken, and for a second, it seemed as if she might not answer at all, as if the question itself did not require a response. But then she spoke, her voice even, measured, without emphasis. "I did not do anything," she said. And the simplicity of the statement might have sounded dismissive to anyone else. But to Richard, it landed differently, because it forced him to confront something far more complex than a direct action. It pointed toward a system, a structure, a network that did not need to be explained to function. He held her gaze, searching for something behind her words, some indication of intent, of strategy, of control, but all he found was consistency. The same quiet presence that had been there from the beginning, unchanged by his reaction, unchanged by the outcome, unchanged by the consequences that had just reshaped his position in a matter of seconds. And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "Some things are already in place long before people notice them." And with that, she returned her attention to the tablet, the conversation ending not with finality, but with a clarity that did not require further explanation, leaving Richard standing there with the realization that what had just happened was not a reaction to him. It was the result of something that had been waiting, something that had only needed the right moment to reveal itself. And he had provided that moment without even realizing it. Richard did not respond immediately, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he was confronted with something he could not immediately break down, quantify, or control, and that absence of clarity lingered in the air between them longer than any confrontation could have, because silence, when it comes from certainty, is far more powerful than noise driven by ego. He watched her for a moment, really watched her now, not as a role, not as a position, but as a presence, trying to reconcile the simplicity of what he saw with the magnitude of what had just happened, and the disconnect unsettled him, because everything about her suggested ordinariness, and yet nothing about the outcome aligned with that assumption. "You expect me to believe that," he said finally, his voice steady again, but no longer sharp, no longer dismissive. Instead, carrying a tone that revealed something he would never openly admit. Doubt, not in her, but in himself, in his ability to read a situation that had just proven itself far more complex than he had allowed. Olivia did not look up this time, her attention still on the tablet, her fingers moving with quiet precision as she completed whatever task was in front of her, and when she spoke, it was without interruption to her motion. "It does not matter what you believe," she said calmly. "It matters what has already been decided." And the phrasing struck him, not because of what it said, but because of how final it sounded, as if the outcome he was still trying to understand had been concluded long before he had even entered the room. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward the table where the deal had unraveled, now empty, cleared, reset, as if the entire negotiation had never existed, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. The speed with which something so significant could be erased without resistance, without negotiation, without even a visible struggle. "Decided by who?" he asked, his voice lower now, more measured because the question was no longer rhetorical, it was necessary, and for the first time, he was not asking to challenge, he was asking to understand. Olivia paused then, just slightly, her hand resting on the edge of the tablet, as if considering the question not for its difficulty, but for its relevance, and when she finally looked up, her gaze met his with the same steady clarity that had not wavered since the beginning. "By the people who do not need to raise their voice to be heard," she said, and the words settled into him with a weight that was difficult to ignore, because they reframed everything he had just experienced, not as an attack, not as a reaction, but as a quiet correction, a shift imposed by something more structured than emotion, more deliberate than impulse. He held her gaze for a moment longer, searching for any indication that this was personal, that it was directed at him specifically. But there was none, no resentment, no satisfaction, no visible trace of intention. Only consistency. And that was what made it more unsettling than any confrontation could have been, because it meant he had not been targeted. He had simply crossed a line he did not see, a line that existed regardless of his awareness. Another message appeared on his phone, and this time, he did not rush to read it, because he already understood the pattern, the sequence, the inevitability of what followed, and instead, he slipped the device into his pocket, the need for immediate information, replaced by a deeper understanding that the outcome was no longer in motion. It was complete. Olivia returned to her work without another word, the conversation dissolving not through dismissal, but through completion, leaving Richard standing there with something far more difficult to process than loss, perspective, and as he turned slightly, preparing to leave a room he had once controlled without question, he realized that the most significant part of what had just happened was not the deal he lost, but the assumption he had carried into the room, the belief that power was always visible, always loud, always his. And as he took his first step away, that belief no longer felt certain, it felt exposed. Richard's footsteps were slower now, not because he intended them to be, but because each step carried a weight that had not been there when he first entered the room, a subtle hesitation that came from recalculating something far deeper than a failed negotiation. And as he moved past tables filled with quiet conversations and carefully measured laughter, he became aware of something unfamiliar, not judgment, not even curiosity, but indifference, the kind that appears when someone's influence no longer defines the space around them. The restaurant had not changed, the lighting was still warm, the atmosphere still refined, but his place within it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, not tonight, and perhaps not at all. Near the entrance, a staff member stepped aside politely, offering a brief nod, the same professional courtesy he had received when he arrived, but it felt different now, because courtesy without recognition carries a very different meaning, and Richard noticed it, even if he did not react to it outwardly. Behind him, the table where the deal had unraveled was already being reset, fresh linens placed with precision, glasses replaced, chairs aligned perfectly, as if preparing for the next opportunity, and the efficiency of it all made something clear. The world he operated in did not pause for losses, it simply moved on, replacing one moment with the next without hesitation. His hand brushed against his phone again, but he did not take it out. This time, because there was nothing left to confirm, nothing left to verify. The sequence had completed itself, and whatever systems had been activated were no longer in motion. They had reached their conclusion. As he reached the doorway, he paused, just slightly, his gaze shifting back into the room, not searching for answers anymore, but acknowledging what had already been revealed, and his eyes found Olivia once again, still moving with the same quiet rhythm, speaking softly to another guest, adjusting a setting, her presence unchanged by everything that had just occurred, and that consistency, that complete absence of reaction, held more weight than any display of authority ever could. For a moment, he considered turning back, saying something more, asking another question, but the thought passed quickly, replaced by a realization that whatever he had just experienced was not something that could be explained in a conversation. It was something that had to be understood over time, if it could be understood at all. Outside, the night air felt cooler, sharper, the city lights stretching across the street in steady lines of motion, cars passing, people walking, everything continuing without interruption, and Richard stood there for a brief second, adjusting his jacket once more, a familiar motion that now felt less like control and more like habit. His driver approached from across the curb, opening the door with quiet efficiency, but before stepping in, Richard glanced back one last time through the glass, the restaurant still glowing behind him, unchanged, as if nothing had happened inside those walls. And yet everything had changed for him, and as he finally took his seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound, one thought settled into his mind with a clarity that had not been there before. Power is not proven in the moments you command attention. It is revealed in the moments you lose it, and somewhere behind him, in a room that had already moved on, someone who never raised her voice had just shown him exactly what that meant. The car pulled away from the curb with quiet precision, blending into the steady flow of traffic as if it had always been part of it, and Richard leaned back into the leather seat, his posture composed, but his mind anything but settled, because for the first time in years, he was not thinking about the next move, the next acquisition, the next advantage. He was replaying a single moment, again and again, searching for the exact point where control had slipped from his hands without warning. The city lights passed by in long reflections across the window, each one stretching and fading, mirroring the way certainty had begun to dissolve into something less defined, less predictable, and his phone remained still in his hand, silent now, as if even the constant stream of updates had recognized that there was nothing left to report. The outcome had already been decided. "Sir," his driver's voice came from the front, careful, professional. "Would you like me to head back to the office?" And for a brief second, Richard considered it, the instinct to return to a controlled environment, to reassert structure, to rebuild strategy, but something held him back, something that told him that whatever had just happened could not be corrected by routine, by schedules, by the systems he had always relied on. "No," he said finally, his voice steady but quieter than usual. "Just drive." And the simplicity of the instruction reflected a shift he had not fully acknowledged yet, the need to process before acting, something he had rarely allowed himself to do. His gaze moved back to the window, but his thoughts returned to the room he had just left, to the silence after his voice had cut through the air, to the way everything had changed not with confrontation, but with stillness, and most of all, to her. Olivia. Not as a waitress, not as a role, but as a presence that had remained unchanged while everything around her shifted, and that consistency unsettled him more than any direct challenge could have, because it suggested something deeper than reaction, something rooted in structure, in position, in understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, scrolling through the messages with a slower, more deliberate focus now, not searching for solutions, but for patterns, and the more he read, the clearer it became. This had not been a spontaneous collapse. It had been coordinated, triggered, aligned across multiple layers at once: compliance, legal, investor relations, all responding within seconds of each other. And that level of synchronization did not happen without design. One message in particular caught his attention, flagged earlier but overlooked in the flood: a short internal note from a senior analyst. External influence detected, source unidentified, response initiated at system level. And that line lingered, because it confirmed what he had begun to suspect. This had not been a reaction to risk, it had been a response to a signal, and the question that followed was no longer whether something had triggered it, but who had the authority to send that signal. The car slowed at a red light, the city briefly pausing around him. And in that stillness, the answer began to form, not as a conclusion, but as a possibility he could no longer dismiss, because the timing, the precision, the quiet certainty of her presence, it all pointed in one direction, one that challenged everything he had assumed about power, about visibility, about hierarchy. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, composed, controlled, but different now, not diminished, but recalibrated, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. And as the light turned green and the car moved forward once again, one thought remained clear: he had not just lost a deal tonight. He had been introduced to a level of influence he had never accounted for. And somewhere behind that quiet moment in a crowded room, there was a system, a structure, a network that did not need recognition to operate, only the right moment to reveal itself. And he had just experienced what happened when it did. The realization did not bring immediate clarity. It brought a deeper question, one that lingered long after the car had merged into the rhythm of the city, because if what had happened was not random, not emotional, and not reactive, then it meant one thing: there was a structure operating beyond visibility, and Richard had just collided with it without understanding its boundaries. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting just above his knees, the posture less about control now and more about focus, because for the first time in a long time, he was not trying to dominate a situation, he was trying to understand it. And that shift, subtle as it was, changed the way he looked at everything that had just unfolded. His phone lit up again, not with urgency this time, but with a follow-up from his internal team, a longer message detailing preliminary findings. And as he read through it, the pattern became clearer. The response had not originated from a single source. It had been distributed, triggered across multiple independent checkpoints that rarely aligned so quickly unless there was a common signal recognized at a higher level, something embedded deep within the systems he had always trusted to operate predictably. One line stood out, buried within the report, but impossible to ignore: protocol recognition initiated through hospitality network clearance. And he read it twice, then a third time, because the phrasing did not match any standard alert he was familiar with. It pointed towards something niche, something specialized, a classification that existed within certain environments but remained invisible to those outside of it. His mind moved quickly now, connecting pieces, the location, the nature of the deal, the type of partners involved, and then her, Olivia, not as an individual, but as part of that environment, part of a system that he had overlooked entirely because he had categorized it as insignificant. He leaned back again, his gaze shifting to the passing lights outside, but his focus was no longer on the city, it was on the structure behind the moment, the possibility that certain spaces operated under layers of oversight he had never needed to consider before, where authority did not present itself through titles or wealth, but through access, through clearance, through the ability to trigger responses without explanation. Hospitality network, he repeated quietly under his breath. The words unfamiliar in this context, and yet the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. High-level environments, international clients, sensitive negotiations. These were not just restaurants. They were controlled spaces, monitored, protected, integrated into systems designed to safeguard more than service standards. His driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, noticing the shift in tone but saying nothing, because whatever was unfolding in the back seat was not something that required interruption. Richard's grip on his phone tightened slightly, not out of frustration, but out of realization, because if Olivia was connected to that network, even indirectly, then her presence in that moment was not passive. It was positional, and the action he had dismissed as insignificant may have been interpreted as something else entirely within a system designed to respond without hesitation. He closed his eyes for a brief second, replaying the exact moment again, her hand, his voice, the silence, and then the response, immediate, precise, irreversible. And when he opened them again, there was a different kind of clarity there, not about what had happened, but about what it meant, because for the first time, he understood that power does not always come from ownership or wealth. Sometimes, it comes from being embedded in the right system, at the right level, with the authority to act without needing to explain why. The car continued forward, steady and uninterrupted, but inside, something fundamental had shifted, not broken, not diminished, but expanded, forced to account for a layer of influence he had never needed to see before. And as he looked down at the final line of the report, one detail confirmed what he could no longer deny. Source identified as internal clearance. Priority. And in that moment, Richard understood that whatever Olivia was, whatever role she truly held, she had not just been part of the environment, she had been one of the few people in that room who had the authority to define it. The words stayed on the screen longer than they should have, not because they were unclear, but because of how much they revealed without directly explaining anything. Internal clearance priority, a phrase that did not belong in ordinary business language, a classification that existed above negotiation, above influence, above the kind of leverage Richard had built his entire career around. And as the car continued through the city, he realized that what he had encountered was not just a person, but a position, one that operated within a system he had never needed to consider before tonight. His mind moved backward again, reconstructing every detail with a new lens. The restaurant was not just a restaurant. It was a controlled environment. The staff were not just service workers. They were part of a network designed to maintain order at a level most guests never noticed. And Olivia, calm, precise, unnoticed, had been positioned at the exact point where visibility met control, where a single action could be interpreted not as service, but as access. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand resting against his chin as the implications settled deeper. Because if that was true, then the moment he raised his voice was not just a display of arrogance. It was a breach, not of etiquette, but of protocol, and systems built around protocol do not respond emotionally. They respond immediately, consistently, without hesitation. The driver turned onto a quieter street, the hum of the city softening. But inside the car, the clarity sharpened, and Richard's phone lit up once more, this time with a direct message from his chief operations officer. The tone formal, controlled. We have confirmed activation of Tier 1 protective response linked to hospitality oversight. All associated transactions have been flagged and suspended pending review. And that confirmation removed any remaining doubt. What had happened was not a coincidence. It was an automated escalation triggered by a specific condition, one that he had unknowingly activated. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in recognition. Because for years he had operated under the assumption that every system could be navigated, influenced, or controlled with the right leverage, the right connections, the right pressure points. But this was different. This system did not negotiate. It did not respond to status. It responded to signals, and once triggered, it followed its course without deviation. Turn around, he said suddenly, his voice steady, and the driver glanced back, slightly surprised. Sir, take me back. Richard repeated, not with urgency, but with intention, because there was something unfinished, something he needed to confirm, not for the deal, not for the loss, but for the understanding of what he had just encountered. The car slowed, then shifted direction smoothly, merging back toward the glow of the restaurant he had just left, and as they approached, the building looked exactly the same, elegant, composed, untouched by the events that had unfolded within it. And yet Richard knew now that what existed inside those walls operated on a level far beyond appearances. When the car stopped, he stepped out without hesitation, the cool night air hitting him again. But this time it did not distract him, it focused him. And as he walked back toward the entrance, his posture was different, not diminished, but adjusted, the confidence still there, but tempered with awareness. Inside, the room had fully reset, new guests seated, new conversations flowing. And Olivia was there, exactly where she had been before, moving with the same quiet precision, the same calm presence, as if nothing had changed, and perhaps, for her, nothing had. Richard approached once more, stopping at the same distance as before, but this time, there was no tension, no demand, only a clear intention to understand. And when she looked up, meeting his gaze again, the silence between them felt different, not unresolved, but ready, as if whatever came next would not undo what had happened, but would finally explain it. Richard did not speak immediately, not because he lacked the words, but because this time, he understood that speaking too quickly was what had led him here in the first place, and the difference between what had happened earlier and this moment was not the setting, not the person, but his awareness of it. Olivia stood exactly as she had before, her posture unchanged, her expression steady. The quiet consistency of someone who did not need to adjust to the environment because she was already aligned with it. And as she looked at him, there was no surprise, no reaction to his return, only recognition, as if she had expected this moment to come, not because of who he was, but because of what he had just experienced. "I understand now," Richard said finally, his voice lower, measured, not seeking to dominate the space, but to meet it. And the statement was not a claim, it was an acknowledgement, one that carried weight because it came after everything had already been taken from him. Olivia tilted her head slightly, not in curiosity, but in quiet evaluation, as if considering whether the words were accurate or simply an attempt to regain footing. And for a brief moment, the room seemed to soften around them, the sounds of conversation fading just enough to create a space where clarity could exist without interruption. "Then you understand it was not about you," she replied, her tone even, not dismissive, not sympathetic, simply precise. And that distinction mattered, because it removed the personal aspect he had been trying to assign to the situation, replacing it with something far more structured, far more impersonal. Richard nodded once, slowly, because he did understand that now. The reaction had not been emotional. It had been procedural, triggered by a condition, executed by a system, and completed without hesitation. And yet, understanding the structure did not answer the deeper question that remained. "You are part of it," he said, not as a question, but as a realization spoken aloud. And this time, Olivia did not immediately respond, her silence stretching just long enough to confirm that the statement had weight, that it was closer to the truth than anything he had said before. She set the tablet down gently, her hands resting lightly against the surface of the service station, and when she spoke, her words were careful, not because they needed to be, but because they were deliberate. "I work where alignment matters," she said, and the phrasing was subtle, but it carried more meaning than a direct explanation ever could, because it implied position without declaring it, authority without displaying it. Richard absorbed the words, not fully satisfied, but no longer expecting a complete answer, because he was beginning to understand that whatever system she was part of did not reveal itself through explanation, it revealed itself through outcome, and he had already witnessed that outcome firsthand. "And if I had said nothing?" he asked, his voice steady, the question no longer defensive, but reflective. "If I had let the moment pass?" And Olivia met his gaze again, her expression unchanged, but there was something different now, not in what she showed, but in what she allowed, a fraction more openness, a fraction more clarity. "Then nothing would have happened," she said simply. And that answer landed with a quiet finality, because it confirmed everything. He had begun to understand. The system had not targeted him, it had responded to him, and the difference between those two realities was everything. Richard exhaled slowly, the tension that had been building throughout the evening finally releasing, not because the situation had been resolved, but because it had been understood, and understanding, in this case, carried more value than reversal ever could. He gave a small nod, not of agreement, but of acknowledgement, and for the first time since. The evening began. There was no need to assert, no need to question, no need to challenge, only to recognize what had been revealed. Olivia picked up the tablet again, her attention returning to her work with the same quiet precision. The conversation closing not with a conclusion, but with a clarity that did not require one. And as Richard stood there for a moment longer, he realized that the most significant shift of the night was not the loss of the deal, but the understanding that power, real power, does not need to be displayed to exist. It only needs to be recognized when it chooses to act. Richard did not linger this time, not because there was nothing left to say, but because he understood that nothing more needed to be said, and that realization, simple as it was, carried a weight far greater than any negotiation he had ever walked away from. Because this was not about winning or losing, it was about seeing something he had never accounted for, something that had always existed just outside the boundaries of his awareness. He gave a final, almost imperceptible nod, not to Olivia as a person, but to the position she represented, to the system she embodied without ever announcing it. And then he turned, his steps measured, steady, no longer driven by urgency or frustration, but by a quiet recalibration that had already begun to reshape the way he viewed the world around him. The restaurant continued as it always had, conversations flowing, glasses catching the warm light, new guests arriving without any knowledge of what had just unfolded within those walls. And Olivia moved among them with the same calm precision, her presence blending seamlessly into the environment she helped define, unchanged, unshaken, and completely unbothered by the outcome that had altered someone else's trajectory so dramatically. As Richard reached the entrance once more, he paused briefly, not to look back in confusion, but to acknowledge the clarity he now carried, because the difference between those two states mattered. One kept you searching, the other allowed you to move forward. Outside, the night air felt different this time, not colder, not sharper, but clearer, as if the noise that had once filled his thinking had been stripped away, leaving behind something more precise, more grounded. And as he stepped toward the waiting car, his reflection in the glass caught his attention for a brief second, not as a man who had just lost a deal, but as someone who had just encountered a level of structure he had never been forced to recognize before. He entered the car without hesitation, the door closing softly behind him, and as the vehicle began to move, he did not reach for his phone. He did not call his team. He did not attempt to repair what had been undone, because he understood now that some outcomes are not meant to be reversed. They are meant to be understood. The city lights stretched ahead, steady and endless. And for the first time that evening, his thoughts were not racing to catch up. They were aligned, focused on a single truth that had emerged from everything that had happened. Power is not defined by how loudly it is expressed, but by how precisely it operates when it chooses to act. Somewhere behind him, in a space that had already reset and moved on, Olivia continued her work without interruption, her role complete.